The alien quarantine ship Verratix floated in low orbit above Earth, its sleek, sterilized hull glinting like a blade against the dark void. Inside its antiseptic halls, the crew of Skorvixians, a species renowned across the galaxy for their mastery of medicine and sanitation, convened in the command chamber. At the center of the room, Commander Zilran stood before a holographic projection of Earth, his elongated fingers tapping an irregular rhythm on the console. His biosensors, embedded like shimmering jewels along his temples, glowed faintly, a physiological marker of agitation. Dr. Viltora, the ship's chief epidemiologist, adjusted her own biosensors as she zoomed in on the swirling greens and blues of Earth. The display flickered to show a stream of data captured from the planet's surface. "Do you truly believe contact is wise?" Viltora asked, her green-hued skin darkening slightly, a sign of professional unease. The humans. Their behavior suggests a troubling disregard for biosecurity. The hologram shifted to a series of video clips. One clip showed a crowded human marketplace, where a man sneezed openly without covering his mouth. Another displayed a child on a dirt path, licking a scraped finger. A third clip focused on a busy urban hospital with overworked staff moving between patients, some in crisis, others coughing or bleeding. Viltora folded her arms and turned to Zilran. "This is chaos," she said, her voice tinged with incredulity. "They treat pathogens as though they are mere inconveniences, yet they persist. Their population thrives despite environmental conditions that should have obliterated them millennia ago." Zilran exhaled sharply, his biosensors flickering. "We have no choice. Their representatives have requested a meeting to address the planetary health crisis they claim to have under control. However reckless their methods, Earth's pathogens are mutating. If these microorganisms escape their planet, they could devastate less adaptable species across the galaxy." Viltora flicked the hologram to display another set of data. Reports suggest rapid microbial evolution in their atmosphere bacteria, with resistance rates growing at unprecedented speeds. It's no longer hypothetical. We have visual confirmation of this resistance in action. Zilran's fingers tightened on the console. "We must assess their medical strategies. If they cannot contain their microbial threats, they may require intervention from the Intergalactic Medical Council." Viltora's voice rose slightly. "Intervention? Commander, these are a people who ingest unregulated chemicals to combat infections. I fail to see how cooperation with them will benefit the galaxy, much less the Skorvixians." "Perhaps we can learn from them," Zilran said, his tone measured. "The humans may possess insights into survival that defy our understanding." Viltora's biosensors flared red. "They shrug at an epidemiological disaster, Commander." They shrugged, as though it were a trivial matter. A ripple of unease swept through the other Skorvixians in the room. Their culture thrived on order, sterility in environment, precision in practice, and unwavering control over variables. The thought of engaging with a species that treated pathogens with nonchalance was deeply unsettling. Zilran raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Prepare the decontamination chamber. Summon the human envoy. Let us hope their biology is as durable as their recklessness suggests." Paul Harrington adjusted his tie and squinted against the pulsating purple lights of the Verratix's quarantine chamber. A metallic voice echoed from the chamber walls. "Decontamination phase 1 complete. Cellular integrity intact. Continuing sterilization." Paul sighed, leaning back against the wall as a faint mist enveloped him. The process had been going on for nearly an hour, and the sterile scent of antiseptic was beginning to sting his nose. "This really necessary?" he muttered into the comm link embedded in his lapel. "I took a shower this morning." The voice of Mission Commander Sanchez crackled back. "Just deal with it, Harrington. You're representing humanity here. Besides, these guys sterilize everything, probably their breakfast too." Paul smirked. "Feels like I'm in a sci-fi car wash." The chamber's metallic voice interrupted. "Decontamination phase 2 complete. Specimen sanitized." The heavy door slid open with a hiss, and Paul stepped into the corridors of the Verratix. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, and the walls gleamed with a near-blinding cleanliness. Even the floor beneath his polished shoes felt unnervingly smooth, like it had been buffed down to molecular perfection. Waiting for him was Commander Zilren, who wore a uniform that seemed less like clothing and more like armor, complete with embedded filtration systems and faintly shimmering gloves. Beside him stood Dr. Viltora, her wary gaze fixed on Paul, as though he might sprout spores at any moment. "Welcome aboard the Verratix," Zilren said, his tone polite but distant. "I trust the decontamination process was tolerable." "Tolerable," Paul replied with a crooked grin, "though I wouldn't recommend it as a spa treatment." Zilren's biosensors flickered faintly, an indicator Paul couldn't interpret. "The procedure is essential. Human biology, while remarkably adaptable, is saturated with microbial risks. Tell me, Mr. Harrington, how does your species survive in such an environment?" Paul shrugged, his grin widening. "We've got immune systems. They do most of the heavy lifting. And if that's not enough, we've got antibiotics, vaccines, you name it. Modern medicine's pretty good." Dr. Viltora's biosensors flashed red. "Immune systems? You rely on unmonitored cellular responses to manage pathogenic threats." "Well, yeah," Paul said. "And if something gets past that, we just take a pill." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small orange bottle of antibiotics. Broad-spectrum stuff. Pretty standard. Couple of these and you're good as new. Viltora recoiled slightly. "You ingest chemicals without a complete understanding of their molecular interactions." Paul blinked. Yeah? Isn't that the point of medicine?" The Skorvixians exchanged uneasy glances. Zilren leaned closer, his biosensors flickering softly. "You do not fear the risks of mutation, resistance, or unintended cellular damage." "Of course we do," Paul said. "That's why we test the stuff before we use it. But sometimes, you've got to take risks to get results." "Risks," Viltora repeated, her voice tinged with incredulity. "You gamble with microbial evolution and call it progress." Paul chuckled. "Pretty much. Look, we don't live in a bubble. Earth's messy and we've learned to live with that. Maybe even thrive in it." The meeting that followed was tense but productive. Seated at a circular table in the council chamber, Paul answered a barrage of questions about Earth's medical practices. The Skorvixians' reactions ranged from alarm to bewildered as they learned about humanity's reliance on reactive treatments and their casual interactions with pathogens. "You expose yourselves to microbial chaos daily," Viltora said, her voice rising. "And yet you thrive. How?" "By rolling with the punches," Paul said. "We adapt. It's not perfect, but it works." Zilren leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Your methods are unorthodox, Mr. Harrington, but your survival speaks for itself. Perhaps there is merit to your adaptability." Paul smiled. "Glad to hear it. Maybe we can teach each other a thing or two." Zilren extended a gloved hand, and Paul shook it firmly. Though the gesture was stiff, Paul could feel a faint shift in the air between them, a small step toward understanding. As Paul left the chamber, he couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Humanity, a species that had nearly forgotten to wash its hands before dinner, was now brokering alliances with creatures who sterilized their shadows. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And humanity, Paul thought with a grin, always found a way. The day after his initial meeting, Paul Harrington was escorted to the Verratix's state-of-the-art medical laboratory. He couldn't help but marvel at the sheer precision of the place. Equipment hummed with energy, gleaming surfaces were free of even microscopic blemishes, and the Skorvixians moved with a meticulousness that bordered on choreography. "This way, Mr. Harrington," Dr. Viltora said, her voice clinical. She gestured toward a sleek table surrounded by glowing instruments. "You will assist us in a controlled exposure trial. This is an opportunity to assess your immune system's response to an organism we would consider pathogenic." Paul raised an eyebrow as he looked at the equipment. "You're going to hit me with alien germs." "It's not a germ," Viltora corrected, her biosensors glowing faintly. "It is a bacterium from Verratix prime, Morvrak 9, a common microbe in stagnant aquatic systems. It is largely inert to most species, though it presents a mild respiratory challenge in vulnerable populations. We have chosen it because of its benign characteristics relative to other pathogens." Paul hesitated. So you're saying it's safe? For you. Yes, Viltora replied. Your physiology appears robust enough to handle it. For our species, exposure without strict monitoring would be unthinkable. Paul shrugged and rolled up his sleeve. All right, Doc, let's get this over with. Viltora pressed a sleek injection device to his arm. A faint hiss followed, and Paul barely felt the needleless administration of the bacteria. Almost immediately, the lab sensors came to life, their soft pings and hums creating a symphony of data. Vital signs are stable, Viltora said, scanning the monitors. Early immune activation detected. A surge in macrophage production. Paul glanced at the display. Macrophages are good, right? They are the first line of your body's immune response, Viltora explained. They engulf and digest invaders. Your system appears to be reacting efficiently. The Skorvixian researchers crowded around the holographic projection, their expressions ranging from intrigue to disbelief. This response is remarkably fast, murmured one of them. He has a standing army of immune cells already mobilized. That's because my immune system is used to being on alert, Paul said. Back home I'm surrounded by bacteria, viruses, fungi, you name it. This Morvrak thing is probably tame compared to what I've dealt with before. Viltora frowned. You mean to say your body has built this resilience through constant exposure? Pretty much, Paul said. It's like practice. You get sick, your immune system learns, and next time you're stronger. Viltora's biosensors pulsed red. That is the most reckless system of immunological development I have ever encountered. Hey, it works, Paul replied, grinning. The experiment continued for several hours, during which Paul's vitals remained stable. The lab's sensors tracked every aspect of his immune response, from the initial macrophage surge to the production of antibodies specifically designed to neutralize Morvrak 9. This is extraordinary, Viltora admitted, her voice tinged with reluctant admiration. Your immune system not only recognizes the threat but neutralizes it with precision. And yet... Paul raised an eyebrow. And yet what? And yet this process comes with significant risks, Viltora said. Your system relies on encountering pathogens to build defenses. What if the pathogen overwhelms it before adaptation occurs? Then we rely on medicine to pick up the slack, Paul said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a familiar orange pill bottle. Like these. Antibiotics are a lifesaver when your immune system can't keep up. The Skorvixians exchanged uneasy glances. We have reviewed your antibiotics extensively, Viltora said. Their mechanisms are highly effective against Earth pathogens, but their indiscriminate use creates risks. Your species seems dangerously reliant on these chemicals to compensate for biological vulnerabilities. Paul leaned back. That's not totally wrong. We've got issues with resistance, for sure, but we're always adapting, finding new treatments, new strategies. It's a race, but so far we're keeping up. A race against microbial evolution, Viltora muttered. Fascinating, but unsustainable. The situation aboard the Verratix shifted dramatically the following morning. Paul was awoken by an urgent summons to the medical deck, where he found the laboratory in disarray. Dr. Viltora and Commander Zilren were huddled over a holographic display, their faces grim. What's going on? Paul asked, his voice still groggy. Zilren gestured to the display, which showed a diagram of the ship's air filtration system. Red indicators pulsed through the ducts like spreading flames. A bacterium from your microbiome has entered our ventilation system, Zilren said tightly. We believe it originated from your clothing or skin. Paul's heart sank. Which bacterium are we talking about? Viltora zoomed in on the hologram to reveal the culprit Staphylococcus epidermidis. This organism appears harmless to you, she said, her tone icy. But to us, it is invasive and opportunistic. Already, 3 crew members are displaying symptoms of respiratory distress. Paul ran a hand through his hair. Staph epidermidis? That's like the most boring bacteria ever. It's everywhere back on Earth. It's not even dangerous unless you're immune compromised. To us, it is dangerous, Viltora snapped. Our immune systems are calibrated for sterility. not for the microbial gauntlet your species endures daily. If we do not act, this could spread rapidly. Over the next few hours, the ship's medical team worked tirelessly to contain the outbreak. Sterilization protocols were enhanced, and symptomatic crew members were isolated in negative pressure chambers. Despite their efforts, the bacteria continued to spread through the ventilation system, adapting to the ship's antiseptic environment. "We need a targeted solution," Viltora said, her biosensors pulsing red as she analyzed the situation. "Earth antibiotics are incompatible with our physiology. Introducing them into our systems could cause widespread cellular damage." Paul nodded. "Right, but what if we don't use the antibiotics directly? What if we tailor something new, something that works for both your biology and the bacteria's weak points?" Viltora frowned. "A hybrid treatment." "Exactly," Paul said. "Your tech is incredible. If we can map the bacteria's vulnerabilities, we can design a treatment that won't fry your cells." Zilran considered this. "It is a risky proposition, but we have no better alternatives." The collaboration was tense but productive. Using the ship's advanced molecular analysis tools, the team identified similarities between Staphylococcus epidermidis and native Skorvixian microbes. Paul suggested starting with a beta-lactam framework common in earth antibiotics and modifying it to suit Skorvixian physiology. "It's like reverse engineering a puzzle," Paul said, watching as the ship's nanofabricators synthesized the first test batch of the hybrid compound. "We're taking what works for us and tweaking it to work for you." Viltora glanced at him, her expression skeptical. "I remain unconvinced that this gamble will succeed." "It's not about guarantees," Paul replied. "It's about giving your crew a fighting chance." By the time the first doses were ready, 3 more crew members had fallen ill. The treatment, a nasal spray designed to deliver the hybrid antibiotic directly to the respiratory system, was administered cautiously, with biosensors tracking every response. To everyone's relief, the initial results were promising. Fever and inflammation began to subside, and the bacteria's reproduction slowed significantly. While the treatment wasn't a complete cure, it bought the patients enough time for their immune systems to adapt. Paul leaned back in his chair, exhausted but relieved. "Told you we'd figure it out." Viltora's biosensors glowed faintly as she reviewed the data. "Your methods are unconventional and reckless, but they are effective. Perhaps there is something to be learned from your adaptability after all." The medical deck of the Verratix had settled into an uneasy calm. While the hybrid antibiotic treatment had stabilized the infected crew members, the outbreak had left the Skorvixians deeply shaken. Their society's reliance on sterility as a safeguard had been brought into question, and the implications rippled through the ship like an aftershock. Paul Harrington found himself in the middle of this introspection. He stood in the observation lounge with Commander Zilran, the holographic display showing Earth as a small blue dot in the distance. "This incident has exposed a flaw in our protocols," Zilran admitted, his voice measured but heavy. "For centuries, we have prided ourselves on eliminating risks, yet we failed to anticipate this scenario." "That's the thing about risk," Paul said. "You can't eliminate it completely. Sometimes it finds a way in, no matter how careful you are." Zilran turned to him, his biosensors pulsing faintly. "And your species embraces this uncertainty." Paul chuckled. "We don't have much choice. Earth is a chaotic place, pathogens, disasters, you name it. The only way we survive is by staying flexible. When something doesn't work, we improvise." Zilran folded his hands thoughtfully. "Your resilience is remarkable, but it is also reckless. Do you not fear the consequences of your improvisation?" "Sure we fear it," Paul said, "but we don't let that stop us. We've learned that progress doesn't come without taking risks. That's what brought us here, to space, to you. And it's what'll keep us moving forward." Down in the lab, Dr. Viltora was less reflective and more pragmatic. She had spent the past several hours dissecting the hybrid antibiotics molecular structure, analyzing how it interacted with both the bacteria and Skorvixian physiology. Paul joined her, watching as streams of data scrolled across her monitors. "Your treatment is functional," she said, not looking up. "But it is a temporary solution. The bacteria have already shown signs of adaptation. If we rely on this compound exclusively, it will lose efficacy. Yet resistance is a pain, Paul said, leaning against a console. That's why we don't just rely on one drug back on Earth. We use combination therapies, hit the bacteria from multiple angles so they can't adapt fast enough. Viltora tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. Explain. Paul grabbed a stylus and drew a crude diagram on the holographic interface. So let's say we've got a bacterium. One antibiotic might attack its cell wall. Another might mess with its protein synthesis. By using both at the same time, you overwhelm the bacteria's defenses. Even if one of the drugs stops working, the other one keeps it in check. Viltora studied the diagram, her biosensors glowing a steady green. Your approach accepts resistance as inevitable and counters it dynamically. It is ingenious. Paul grinned. Thanks, Doc. High praise coming from you. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor. A young Skorvixian technician stumbled into the lab, her biosensors flickering erratically. Dr. Viltora, she gasped. New cases in Sector 7. 2 more crew members have developed symptoms. Viltora's expression darkened. Show me the data. The technician handed over a tablet. Viltora's fingers danced across the screen, and her jaw tightened as she reviewed the report. The bacteria are spreading despite the hybrid treatment. It appears they've adapted to the compound's molecular structure. Paul frowned. That's fast, even for bacteria. The confined environment of the Verratix accelerates their adaptation, Viltora said. Our sterilization systems have created conditions where the bacteria face no competition. They are evolving unopposed. Paul rubbed his temples. Right. No microbial competition means no checks and balances. Back on Earth, our bacteria and fungi are constantly fighting each other, kind of like natural crowd control. Viltora looked at him sharply. Are you suggesting that introducing competition could slow their spread? Maybe, Paul said. If you can safely introduce a benign organism that outcompetes the staff, it could keep it in check. That is an unorthodox solution, Viltora said, but it may be viable. With time running out, the Skorvixians synthesized a harmless strain of Lactobacillus, a bacterium common in Earth probiotics and known for its ability to colonize surfaces and inhibit pathogens. They deployed it into the ventilation system alongside a modified version of the hybrid antibiotic. The results were immediate and striking. The Lactobacillus established itself quickly, occupying the same ecological niche as the Staphylococcus. Unable to compete for resources, the staph population began to decline. Meanwhile, the hybrid antibiotic targeted any remaining colonies, slowing their adaptation and preventing further infections. As the outbreak subsided, the atmosphere aboard the Verratix shifted from tense to reflective. The crisis had forced the crew to confront uncomfortable truths about their reliance on sterility and their vulnerability to microbial threats. Later that evening, Paul sat in the observation lounge with Viltora and Zilran, sharing a rare moment of quiet. You're not as reckless as I first thought, Viltora said, her tone begrudging. Your species' methods are crude, but they are undeniably effective. We're not perfect, Paul said, sipping a cup of the purple alien coffee he was starting to tolerate. But we get the job done. Zilran's biosensors glowed softly as he regarded the Earthling. Your adaptability is both a strength and a weakness, Mr. Harrington. It allows you to survive chaos, but it also leaves you vulnerable to it. True, Paul admitted, but chaos is where the best solutions come from. You've seen it yourselves, this whole thing wouldn't have worked without a little experimentation. Viltora's biosensors flickered faintly, a sign of cautious agreement. Perhaps there is merit to your approach, but it will take time for our society to embrace such uncertainty. Paul leaned back, a satisfied grin on his face. Take your time. We'll be here if you need us. The crisis aboard the Verratix had finally subsided. The hybrid approach of introducing Lactobacillus alongside tailored antibiotics had proven effective, and the crew's recovery was well underway. While the ship's systems hummed with their usual precision, the crew's mindset had irrevocably shifted. Commander Zilran and Dr. Viltora convened a meeting in the ship's main council chamber. Paul Harrington was an honored guest at the circular table, which now projected holograms of Earth's medical practices alongside Skorvixian containment protocols. The incident has made one thing clear, Zilran began, his biosensors glowing faintly. Our reliance on sterility as an absolute safeguard is no longer sufficient. While it has protected us for centuries, it has also left us unprepared for the unknown. Paul nodded, sipping his purple alien coffee. Sounds like you're learning one of humanity's big lessons. Sometimes you've got to let go of perfection and work with what you've got. Dr. Viltora folded her hands, her biosensors glowing in measured intervals. Mr. Harrington, while your methods are unconventional, they have exposed us to strategies we would have never considered. Adaptive medicine, probiotic competition, combination therapies. These concepts are intriguing and, I must admit, effective. Paul grinned. Glad to hear it. So does this mean the Skorvixians are ready to embrace the wild side of medicine? Viltora's sensors flared briefly, a Skorvixian equivalent of an amused chuckle. Let us not get carried away. Your species' willingness to take risks borders on reckless. That's humanity for you, Paul said with a shrug. Zilran leaned forward, his gaze steady. Nevertheless, your species has demonstrated remarkable resilience. Your ability to adapt to chaos, to thrive in environments others would find uninhabitable, it is a strength we cannot ignore. Does this mean we've got a deal? Paul asked. Zilran extended a gloved hand. It means we are open to collaboration. Your species has much to teach us about adaptability, and we, in turn, can offer you the precision and preventative measures we excel at. Paul shook the commander's hand firmly. Sounds like the start of a beautiful partnership. In the following weeks, Earth and the Skorvixians began laying the groundwork for interspecies cooperation in medicine. The Skorvixians provided advanced sterilization technology to Earth's hospitals, offering new tools to combat contamination and prevent the spread of resistant pathogens. Meanwhile, humanity shared its hard-won knowledge of adaptive treatments, combination therapies, and the careful balancing act of using antibiotics without fostering resistance. The partnership was far from perfect. Human unpredictability often clashed with Skorvixian rigidity, but both species recognized the potential of their collaboration. Paul Harrington, now somewhat of a celebrity aboard the Verratix, prepared to return to Earth. As he stood on the observation deck with Zilran and Viltora, he gazed at the planet below, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the sterile whites and silvers of the ship. "You'll come back, won't you?" Zilran asked. Paul smirked. "You kidding? I've got to keep an eye on you lot. Can't have you stealing all our good ideas and taking the credit." Viltora's biosensors pulsed with faint amusement. "It is unlikely we will adopt your good ideas wholesale, but your perspective has opened a door we cannot ignore. Perhaps there is wisdom in embracing a degree of uncertainty." "High praise coming from you," Paul said. Zilran extended his hand once more. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. You have helped us see the galaxy in a new light." Paul shook his hand firmly. "And thanks for not throwing me out the airlock when I showed up with staff. I'd call that a win for everyone." As the Verratix began its ascent into deep space, Paul watched Earth grow larger in the observation window of the shuttle taking him home. He felt a deep sense of pride, not just for himself, but for humanity. For all its flaws, Earth had proven itself resilient, resourceful, and worth saving. And as Paul leaned back in his seat, he couldn't help but grin. Humans might be messy, chaotic, and imperfect, but one thing was certain: they always found a way.